Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. Sometimes there are phrases that end up in the ecosystem all around us that come from old movies or television shows. And sometimes we don't even realize that they came from there. You think of, for instance, the word gaslighting is coming from an old Alfred Hitchcock movie of the 1950s, I suppose. Or sometimes people will say something like, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, without thinking about the fact that this comes from The Godfather. Or you might have somebody who will talk about a person or an institution jumping the shark, and without any reference to that has to do with an old sitcom. Well, there's a phrase like that that has not shown up in the lexicon of the world, but has shown up here in the Moore household. And it's kind of a phrase that I will find myself uttering every once in a while to my wife or to one of my sons, and they know exactly what I mean. It's from this old movie of about, I suppose, 40 years ago, Tootsie, starring Dustin Hoffman. And at one point in the movie, you don't even have to know the plot here to know that you just have a live soap opera that has come completely undone. Craziness happening there, deceit being revealed, people at odds with one another, all kinds of things. And Bill Murray plays a character in the movie, is watching all of this on television. And he realizes the soap opera, of course, is about a hospital where there's a hospital administrator in conflict with the doctors and the nurses. He watches all of this and says, that is one nutty hospital. And I will find myself often these days looking at one situation after the other, whether in the news or in the neighborhood association or somewhere else, and say, that is one nutty hospital. And from what I hear from all of you, from a lot of you, is a very similar sort of reaction. I think in some ways that's heightened when we come to this time of the year, where there's not only this presidential election that we have going on, we're not only trying to still recover out of whatever happened in COVID, and you have denominational conventions that are meeting, that even for people who don't have anything to do with those denominations, often they have neighbors who are saying to them, hey, what happened at the Southern Baptist Convention, to talk about my ancestral home, or the Presbyterian Church in America, or the Episcopal Church? And they bring up a debate or controversy or something else and say, what is going on? It's easy, I think, to kind of lose our bearings. And when you're confronted with a time that seems insane, there are a couple things that we could do. We could lose heart, or we could try to conform by going insane. Neither of those are options for the Christian. And I think often about the 5th chapter of Mark, in which Jesus has cast the demons out of this man who was chained up in the tombs. And the text says that when the villagers saw the man, now clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid, is the way Mark put it. Sometimes sanity can be scarier than insanity, when what one is accustomed to is just conforming to the hubbub around. So here on this show, and at Christianity Today generally, we're here to talk about the craziness, but not for the sake of the craziness, but for the sake of Romans 12, not conforming to the pattern of this world, but offering ourselves up as living sacrifices, being renewed in the inner self through the Word of God. And so today, I want us to hear some voices of sanity and some counsel of sanity in some really crazy times. So you'll hear the voices of Jen Wilkin, Beth Moore, Yuval Levin, the late Tim Keller. Jen Wilkin is going to talk to me about women not getting paid fairly in churches, not in the world, in churches. Beth Moore is going to talk about abuse, how it affected her view of God as Father. Yuval Levin talks about the way that institution after institution after institution seems to be falling apart and why we've got to turn that around because we actually need these institutions. And finally, my friend Tim Keller, who we lost last year, reminds us about forgiveness and how to both be forgiving and to seek justice at the same time. So we're going to try to find some sanity in the middle of all of this craziness in American life and culture today. In this first segment, author Jen Wilkin, who's a Bible teacher, speaker, all over the place, talks about an article that she wrote for Christianity Today called Honor Thy Church Mother with Wages. And it's a really interesting point that she's making because even as many parts of the church are thinking through how do we honor and equip women, one of the things that we often don't think about, whether in complementarian or egalitarian or whatever kind of churches, is pay. And she has some really interesting thoughts about that.
The thought process began with an exploration I've done for a while over the nature of the fifth commandment to honor our fathers and mothers. And a lot of the work that we've done in my own local church around understanding the church as the family of God. And so even the Puritans, you go back to the Westminster Confession, and they understood the fifth commandment to expand beyond just our mothers and fathers by birth. They understood it to be those who were our superiors in experience or age, or who are placed in authority over us.
We're able to figure out how to cooperate without being in agreement on all of those. Is that possible with this debate or
Thank you
not?
for asking such a small and simple question, Dr.
Sorry.
Moore. So I think that we live in fractious times, and so it's difficult to say that any conversation in which people differ is going to come to a place of parity anytime in the near future, but we will certainly all pray that direction. I do think that in the complementarian circle, the issue of preaching has just reached a fever pitch, and who can do it and what is it? And I do think that complementarians can do each other a favor by clarifying terms as much as possible. In other words, what is preaching? What is it not? If it's tone of voice, if it's content, then lots of people are preaching. If it has to do with a particular person in a particular setting, then we've clarified things a great deal. My own church did a lot of work around this, which meant that in a complementarian setting, I've been able to have a lot of clarity about where the lines are. Clarity is kindness. And so this is the work of every local church. You need to land somewhere, and then you need to operate out of that perspective. And I think if we spent less time worrying about what the church next door is doing and more time making sure that our own local church is functioning in a healthy way, then the conversation might simmer down a little. And I also do believe firmly that this issue of the family of God as the paradigm for determining whether a church has a healthy practice of male-female roles should be examined. So if you can quote your theological statement to me all day long, and you can show me all of your, and believe me, I know which passages you're going to quote, and you're
Mhm.
going to tell me how you got there. But when I come and visit your church, I see a family that is functionally an authoritarian father and children and an absentee mother. Then I've got questions about how your practice has translated from your theology into a healthy family.
I think that is exactly right. And that's I think one of the things that if we actually see that biblical pattern of household of God, then we realize there are some things that are different about mothers and
Absolutely.
fathers. But usually those things are not trackable on a chart. They're more in terms of vibe. And so you just can't say, well, the mother's the nurturer
Right.
and the father's
Right.
authoritative, because any father that's only
Mhm.
authoritative and not nurturing is an awful
Mhm.
human being. And any mother that's nurturing and not authoritative
Mhm.
is not going to
That's
be a
right.
mother for long. So you do have most of what we're doing is
Yeah.
in sync with
Yeah,
some
and I think
differences.
too that an important point to note in the discussion of the family of God is that when we have an absentee mother situation in the local church, the women of our churches don't stop looking for a mother. They go outside of the
Mm.
church to find that mother. And one of the things that I find in conversations with pastors through the years is if I were to mention the names of the most influential big C church or parachurch women, they either would know the name but nothing about the woman, or they would not even have heard the name before. And yet these women are
Mm.
functional church mothers for over half of their congregation. And so when we leave the work of ministry undone in the local church, women don't stop looking for women's ministry. They go elsewhere to find it. So you've essentially, by the sin of omission, outsourced spiritual formation of your women to you don't actually know who. It might be the church down the road, or it might be an internet presence. And so that's another reason that having a creative imagination around identifying and developing the gifts of female leaders in your church is significant. Because if you believe that your theology is distinctive in the first place, then don't entrust the formation of half of your congregation to people whose names you barely know and whose theological positions you may have no knowledge of at all.
Last year, my friend Beth Moore uh, published her memoir, All My Knotted Up Life. And in this conversation, Beth and I talk about a really, really heavy subject, her own abuse, and also what it's like being a woman teaching the Bible in contemporary evangelicalism. She also frankly talks about what her own ministry was like in our common denominational background of the Southern Baptist Convention. I found this conversation, as I always do with Beth, to be wise and open, honest, vulnerable, and ultimately very hopeful.
I wanted to be free at this late hour in my life to speak specifically to this monster, which is incest, and get very specific that when I talk about Jesus being able to deliver you from your shame, I know of what I speak. And the other thing, Russell, I felt like sometimes in the larger social media culture, we see abuse treated, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of survivors, lightly. Like
Mhm.
I want to say, and they do too. I don't think you get it. I don't think you understand the ramifications of it and the lifelong ramification. Doesn't mean that you haven't had a lot of healing and that God hasn't put a lot of the broken pieces back together, but you really don't know. And so I felt like, you know what? Let's give this an address and a front door. Let's put it in a town and try to
Mhm.
understand with me what this is like when to tell it, you fear that you are going to tear your family up. But what the
Mhm.
truth is, your family is already torn up. It's just
Right.
torn up under the roof.
Yeah. And you and I both, we can sit here and think of specific faces right now of people we know who
Mm,
have lived through horrific things, came
yes.
forward and told their stories, and then people came after them to just
Yes.
attempt to destroy them to the
Yes.
point that I'm sure a lot of people say, "Well, I don't want to tell my story," and that's even more so when they think, "Well, it must be my fault." Must
Oh,
somehow be my fault.
oh,
And
it's
you
terrible.
really take that on head on in this
Oh,
memoir.
Russell, when I was a little girl in church, there were so many pockets of my really young life that are just blackouts.
Mm,
Like, for instance, I remember one of my birthdays, and it happened to be on a trip. And I think it was because it was away from home. And so just these odd blackouts. But I can remember vividly sitting at my church, First Baptist Church in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, which I will, of course, love to the death. It was the oddity about my story is that it was my safe place. My
mhm,
home was not my safe place. But
yeah.
I think about that and I would glance around me. Now, Russell, this would have been by the time I'm talking first grade, second grade. I would look around me and I would wish so much that I was a good little girl. And
Mhm.
I would wish so much that I had not been so bad. And Russ, I what in the world have you done by the first grade that would be
Yeah.
responsible for that kind of shame? But that is the way a kid takes it on, and the weight of it. Growing up, feeling at the point, I remember being 14 years old and feeling 80. I mean, 80, just feeling like I could barely drag myself down the hall of my home at times because
Mhm.
my childhood just had been ripped right out from under me.
What does that do to your sense of the fatherhood of God?
I have gone back over this 1,000 times because I don't know quite how to explain this except that God must have given me a gift of faith. But let me tell you, somehow as a child, I was able to discern the difference. If you've got a background like mine and you're raised in Sunday school and just those little baby bear chairs, and your teacher is sitting in one
Mhm.
of them too, and I can just see it because her knees are up real high and her pumps. And I mean, I can just see the whole way she's dressed and everything. And the way they would hold up any of us who were raised in Sunday school, you could even see the same picture in your mind that I'm
Yep.
seeing in mine, which is Jesus and all the children are around him. And Russell, somehow, I do not know how, somehow I was able to differentiate that Jesus was safe with children. My Sunday
Mm.
school teachers would say over and over again, Jesus is your best friend. And I would think, I was a thinker. I mean, I would analyze things as a young child. And I would think to myself, wow, I don't even know my very best friend. So here's what I'm going to tell you. So the breakthrough for me that came with God as Father was coming to love Jesus so much, and then him saying, if you know me, you
Mm.
know the Father.
Mhm.
So that would have been, I had to go about it that way. And I, to this day, in most of my prayers, because it's been such a monumental relationship, that had to be so transformed in my thinking of what a father figure would be like in a life, that I still address most of my journal prayers. My dearest Abba, that is my
Mm.
father, to
Mhm.
just remind myself over and over again what a wonderful and loving and secure father that I have.
You know that I have thoughts about this because we've talked about it quite a bit, but when you just look out and you see in evangelical Christianity, we're able to cooperate with different views on something the Bible talks about all the time,
Yes,
baptism. We're
yes,
able to cooperate over
mhm,
differences on the Lord's Supper and church
mhm,
government and so forth. But when it comes to differences, when it comes to women and men,
mhm.
in terms of what exactly how God has gifted us to do, there's this narrowing and
Yes.
narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. And there's always a different group of people who are the heretics at the moment. I mean,
Absolutely.
we have to save
Absolutely.
a space on our little boat here for Rick Warren now
Yes.
because of this.
Yes.
I mean,
Our
why
our
is that
poor
the case?
sinking boat. Our poor sinking boat, Russ. It's just the worst. We every time somebody new gets on it, we're like, we're so sorry. We're so
Right.
sorry. We'll try to find something to laugh about. No, it's the truth. It's the thing. I I'd love to get to the bottom of that. And I don't know how to explain why that is the thing that seems to be one of the biggest hangups of all. And you can, as you said, you can disagree on 1,000 other things. But one of the things I have said often, because I was raised in a very conservative part of evangelicalism, and now not as when I got out in the larger world, I realized, whoa, there is
Yeah.
stuff to the very far right of me. And I'm not talking
Hmm.
politically. I'm talking about doctrinally, and then
Yeah.
just the way we practiced our faith. In other words, I taught Sunday school for
Hmm.
years, for 23 years, and but one of the things that I say now, that if you ask me, Beth, what would you say if you would hold people responsible for that you feel like they really did unfairly in your segment of the body of Christ? And one of the things I would say is that we were taught pretty blatantly certain things as the only orthodox way to possibly interpret it. I mean,
Yeah.
that was it. That was it. There was no other way to be sound in scripture, and no other way to have a high value of scripture than to hold this particular interpretation of these scriptures. And I said so many times, I have never resented, not once, being taught or teaching 1 Timothy 2, for instance. Never,
Hmm.
never, never. What I ended up resenting is too strong a word, but just that complaining about, my complaint back would be that instead of saying, now these are the differing views, now where are egalitarians getting this? Well,
Right.
they would be getting it we did it with eschatology, Russell.
Right. Sure.
I was
Yeah.
taught in my Bible doctrine class, this was going to be this was dispensationalism, this was going to be amillennialist, this was all of these different views. I was taught, and then my doctrine teacher would say, this is where I really land. Why
Hmm.
is it we could not do that? Why was it we had to say, no, anyone that teaches any differently about women, it is heresy. And that's just the bottom line. And I will be on Twitter talking about a ham sandwich. I will be talking about buttermilk cornbread, and some guy,
Or grapes.
grapes, and someone will reply to me. They will give me 1 Timothy chapter 2 about women not teaching men. I'm going, am I teaching you anything? Am I? Am I? I'm trying to share cornbread here. So I do not get it. It feels to me like a power move, like it is a
Yeah.
threat. And I want to say this, Russell Moore, I did not know a single woman in the entire Southern Baptist Convention. Not one, not one. And I knew a lot of women. I know a lot of women
Yeah.
in that world. That was my world.
Hmm.
That was after the pulpit of her church. Did not know one, not one.
Another friend of mine, Yuval Levin, was described to me one time by a very impressive person as the smartest human being alive. And I can't think of a contender to knock him off of that title. He has a new book, American Covenant, that helps us think clearly about institutions in the United States. And Yuval writes from his perspective as a Jewish person, a religious minority in this country, about resilience And the way that if we think about social power just in terms of a fight, who wins and who loses, who's up and who's down, we'll destroy ourselves, and there's too much at stake. And everyone seems to be wondering, how on earth can we actually rebuild institutions when under the surface there is just a constant threat level where it's very hard to differentiate between this is kind of irritating to me and you're abusing and marginalizing me. Do you see that reality?
Yeah.
And if so, how do we get through it?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what happens there is a kind of confusion of roles, a failure to distinguish between what happens inside the institution and what happens outside, a failure to see that institutions rely on different people doing different jobs. And so you can't treat them all as if they were just kind of open arenas for political combat. And in a way, there's a kind of eating your own element to this. That these institutions that operate this way in an outward way, that treat the rest of society as just an arena for savage political combat, that looks only like a take no prisoners kind of assault. Eventually, they're going to turn inward and do the same thing. And if the way you think about how to use social power basically involves that kind of fight to the death, you're eventually going to destroy yourself. And I think we certainly saw that kind of logic operating on the left in recent years. It is happening still. As you say, there are some ways in which that also happens in more right-leaning institutions. Working within an institution requires a lot of patience. It requires a kind of long-term vision of what you're trying to achieve. It requires a lot of tolerance for human beings, who are difficult. We all are.
Mm-hmm.
And the way to amass all of that is to be deeply committed to the purpose of the institution and to see that ultimately what's required in a fallen world is that we work incrementally and gradually toward achieving these positive goods. I think that kind of patience, rooted in that kind of view, is in short supply now in American life in general, and we're seeing the consequences of essentially failures of formation, and those consequences look very ugly for a lot of our institutions.
You have written and spoken quite a bit about this dynamic in which institutions must form trustworthy people, and institutions must be formed by trustworthy people. How do we get out of the cycle, though, when it looks as though almost every institution in American life is in a kind of crisis?
Yeah.
If the institution's not doing that, and we say, well, the answer is there have to be trustworthy people to lead those institutions, but they're not being formed by the institutions. I mean, isn't that a circle
Yeah.
that we can't escape? How do we break that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a very hard question, and I would say a vicious cycle is the way to think about it. It's a process that makes itself worse because it is a kind of repeating cycle. The institutions require a certain kind of person, and that kind of person is only produced by a certain kind of institution. And so where do you start? And I think that's really the question, is where can we intervene? Rather than where is the problem centered, where can we actually do something constructive about it? And those aren't always the same thing. And so it seems to me that argues for starting where we are, for starting first and foremost with ourselves. That is, demanding from ourselves a certain kind of responsibility in the institutions that we are part of, and asking ourselves the question, given the role that I've got here, how should I think about this decision that's in front of me? Not just what do I want and how do I want to be seen, but I'm a teacher, or I'm a police officer, or I'm the president of the United States, and what's required of me here? And then to take that kind of attitude to apply it to our expectations of others and say, well, that guy's a teacher, or a police officer. Well, there's something that demands of them that they're not doing, and to express our dissatisfaction in terms of a failure to live up to institutions. By beginning from where we are and by then helping to shape our expectations of others, basically around questions of responsibility. Responsibility is a really important word in a free society. It really means both taking ownership of that society, saying, this is mine. I'm not just going to stand around and wait for somebody else to solve this problem. I have to do it. And at the same time, also being held accountable and saying certain things are expected of me because I am here, and therefore I've got to live up to those. That's the place where we can start.
One of the heaviest and also lightest moments at the same time, the last year, was at the memorial service for Tim Keller. Because we're sitting there in St. Patrick's Cathedral, all of us grieving the loss of this monumental figure. And we looked down to see the hymns that Tim had chosen for his own funeral, along with the explanations of why he chose each one. And everyone sort of chuckled. It was classic Tim Keller, reminded us the way that we loved him and how important he was to all of us. In this conversation that Tim and I had not terribly long before he left us, he talks about repentance without the cheap grace that just lets people out of accountability. How do you seek justice and also seek restoration and reconciliation? And I think that's especially important right now when often forgiveness is used as a weapon to help empower all kinds of horrible behavior, and at a time when we seem to have forgotten what it even means to forgive or to be forgiven. And Tim shows us here, as he always did, how we're more sinful than we know and more loved than we dare hope, as he said. Here's Tim Keller.
Forgiveness is both a process and a promise. And I think you have to make the promise for the process to work. If you, that forgiveness, another way to put it, I think I got this from David Pallison, forgiveness is granted before it's felt. If you wait to feel it before you grant it, you'll wait forever. Because most people think, if I'm still angry, I haven't forgiven, or I can't forgive until I stop, until the anger goes away. He would say, it's granted before it's felt, because what does it mean to grant forgiveness? Well, first of all, is to remember that you're a sinner. And then secondly, to make a commitment, and this is a little bit of a simplification, not to throw this thing back up into the perpetrator's face, not to throw it up to other people so that they will ruin his reputation, and not to keep bringing it up to yourself. In the macro, I mean, Miroslav Volf's great book, Exclusion and Embrace, which is far more intelligent than my book, but also way less accessible because he wrote it as a philosopher, theologian. But he is writing as a Croatian back in the early 90s, saying, how do we Croatians look at the Serbians for what they're doing to us? And he's also talking about breakdown of human community, and he talks about embrace. I don't feel like I've got the ability to summarize it very well because it's a really great book. But he talks about embrace, meaning that as a Croatian, he has to at least open his arms towards Serbians, meaning make it possible for there to be some kind of forgiveness and reconciliation. He's got that great line I use in the book where Wolf says, forgiveness flounders when I exclude the perpetrator from the community of humans and I exclude myself from the community of sinners. So when I stop thinking of them as an equal human being, but as a sort of a lower life than me, and if I stop thinking of myself as a sinner, then human community just falls apart. And I think that's actually part of what maybe Wendell Berry's talking about with prepay, is that you've got to have that attitude of saying, these other people are human beings like me. I should never look down at any other race or any other class or any other person, that they're low life. And I need to never forget that I'm also a sinner. So small communities break down, big communities break down, urban communities break down without forgiveness.
This is one crazy hospital. And yet, for the Church of Jesus Christ, we're not just a hospital, we're a hospital in a war zone that, as Solzhenitsyn told us, cuts through every human heart. Every human heart. I think about the book Diary of a Country Priest that has this line: "The church is on the march through time as a regiment marches through strange country, cut off from all its ordinary supplies." It's not unusual to be in crazy times. It's not unusual to see things that we thought were stable being rattled. As a matter of fact, the book of Hebrews tells us that God shakes things in order that we may strengthen those things through him that cannot be shaken. That's a good time for us to think about that right now. That means taking seriously what's in front of us, not waving it away or wishing it away, but really seeing it for what it is. And that means sometimes grieving, sometimes lamenting, sometimes acting, but acting with the kind of hope that isn't just reassurance, the kind of hope that, as Paul says, comes from suffering that produces character, that produces endurance, and that endurance produces character, and that character produces hope, and hope is not put to shame. That's the kind of hope that we can have. And that forms people who are reasonable in the sense of having transformed and renewed hearts and minds. And we can take seriously all of this craziness with gospel sanity. And we can remember also that closing word from Diary of a Country Priest. What does it matter? Grace is everywhere. This is Russell Moore, and we'll see you again next week.
If you enjoy The Russell Moore Show, take a second to share this episode with a friend or leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host is Russell Moore. Produced by Ashley Hales. Associate producers are Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.